Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nexa front lawn for this next session, the Frontline Club. Just before we begin, it's time for another Zomato giveaway. Zomato is a sponsor of the Jaipur Literature Festival this year. If you're sitting in a seat with a big red sticker on the back, you are eligible for a prize from Zomato. Do we have someone with a sticker on the back of the seat? Do we have a winner? Nobody has a sticker. You have. Congratulations. Our volunteer will give you your prize giveaway down at the stage here. Thank you. So the Frontline Club is presented to you by Rajasthan Patrika's Leadership Series. And the guests this afternoon are Christina Lam, Anand Gopal, and Lindsey Hilsum in conversation with Rajini Vaidyanathan. Now, unfortunately, to our great sorrow, Dexter Filkins is not able to join this session. Christina Lam is one of Britain's leading correspondents and a best-selling author of 9 books, including as co-writer, I Am Malala. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And she has 5 times been named Foreign Correspondent of the Year, and she was made an OBE by the Queen in 2013. Anand Gopal writes for The New Yorker and The New York Times Magazine, as well as other publications. He is the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. He has won the National Magazine Award and the George Polk Award for his reporting from Iraq and Syria. Lindsey Hilsum is the author of In Extremis, The Life of War Correspondent Marie Colvin, which won the 2019 James Tate Black Prize for biography and has been shortlisted for the Costa Award. Editor of Britain's Channel 4 News, she has covered many of the conflicts of the last 30 years. And our moderator for the session today is Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC South Asia correspondent covering India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal, and more. She appears across BBC TV, radio, and online. Recent coverage includes the Indian elections, Sri Lanka terror attacks, and an interview with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to this session the Frontline Club, presented by Rajasthan Patrika's Leadership Series, Christina Lam, Anand Gopal, Lindsey Hilsum, and Rajini Vaidyanathan.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session all about the life of a foreign correspondent. We're just getting one chair. I don't plan on standing for the whole session. There we go. And have we got enough mics? Okay, right. Just while we set up our technical setup here, this session is all about the life of a foreign correspondent. The cliche that it's a glamorous lifestyle, often men in suits who arrive at a war zone or a dangerous place and then go back to receive a clutch of Emmys or other awards. But of course, the reality, as our esteemed panel know, is quite different. So that's what we're going to be discussing. What are the risks that foreign correspondents take? What are the rewards as well? And why do we do this? Now, just to mention Osni Sayestad, because she wasn't mentioned, she's a last-minute addition, ably filling in for Dexter Filkins, who is not here. So Osni, do you just want to start by quickly telling us a little bit about you, just so that we know about you as well?
Yes, thank you. My name is Åsne Seierstad. I'm from Norway, and I probably got into war journalism just as I got into this panel. No planned. So I was, very briefly, I was studying Russian literature in Moscow. When Russian tanks went into Chechnya, I was just merely starting as a journalist, but thought that I had to be where the story was happening. And I can maybe, you said brief introduction, I can talk about this later, because one interesting thing, this was 1994, 2005, before the internet, before, you couldn't just go online and check what was happening somewhere in the world. And you couldn't trust the Russian media, of course. So, and I couldn't afford having Reuters and wires, so my sources of information was Russian media. And I realized, I just have to go there myself and see what's happening. And when you're a freelancer without any money, how do you go to a war? So I went to the Russian Ministry of Defense because I was thinking, someone are going, that's the soldiers, asking to get on a plane down to Chechnya. And this was the time of Yeltsin, and everything was possible in Moscow. And they said the next plane is leaving at 5 o'clock next morning. Just go on. So that was like, I went there without a map, without anything, and just as I'm here, without any biography mentioned. That's often how war reporting starts.
Okay, thank you. So we now know who all our panel are. A lot of people, I'm also a foreign correspondent, and a lot of people ask me, so I want to ask the panel, why do you do this? Why do you miss, remember an editor said to me, if you want to be a foreign correspondent, you're going to miss weddings, funerals, christenings, you're going to go to unpleasant places. It's not a normal life, in quotes. So Christina, let's start with you. Why do you do this? You've reported from all over the world. Why do you still do this?
I do it because I think it's an absolute privilege to go to these places where interesting things are happening and see them firsthand. And I have never been bored in 32 years of being a foreign correspondent. I don't think there's many jobs where you can say that. So, and you just meet amazing people and go to interesting places. Yes, sometimes it's very difficult and frustrating, and most of the time we're going to places where people really don't want us. But I think that it's important that people know about what's happening in these places, and that we tell the stories of how people are living there.
Just because Osne told us about her unusual entrance into the profession, you had quite an unusual story about how you ended up becoming a foreign correspondent.
Yeah. I became a foreign correspondent because of a wedding invitation. I never set out to cover war. I grew up in South London. The most dangerous thing I'd ever done was finding my way home late at night if I missed the last bus. And so one day when I left university, I was working as an intern at the Financial Times and got to go to a lunch of South Asian politicians and met somebody from Benazir Bhutto's party. And he asked me if I would like to interview her because she was living in exile in London at the time. Of course, I said yes. And the day I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So the flat was absolutely full of the most amazing bouquets of flowers. Anyway, we got on very well. She then went back to Pakistan to try and topple General Zia. And I got a job in local TV in Birmingham in England. And actually it was a really miserable job because I was their first ever trainee and the only woman who wasn't a presenter. And when I got home from work one day, there was this most beautiful gold inscribed invitation on my mat, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Karachi, which was my first introduction to Pakistan, and as you can imagine, an amazing introduction to Pakistan. So I never went back to the job in Birmingham. In fact, the last story I ever did on British TV was a man who turned his car back to front so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. So I think it was a huge loss to television.
Okay, thank you. Lindsey, a lot of people, when you say you're a foreign correspondent, the first thing they say, oh, but it's such a dangerous job. What are the realities? I mean, you have been covering so many dangerous places, but what are the realities that keep you going to do this?
Well, the reality is, of course, it's sometimes dangerous, but you calculate the risks. And you were talking then about, yes, it's a lifestyle where you are often going to miss weddings and christenings. That's another reason I do it, so that I can miss the weddings and the christenings and things. You've got an excuse. Any family event you don't want to go to, you just say, I'm sorry, I'm on the road. And everyone goes, oh, yes, she does such an important, dangerous job. It's fine. You're excused to everything. So that's a good reason. But like Christina, I believe that knowledge is better than ignorance. And I believe that certainly if you come from a Western country, it's important that our citizens know what's done in our name, what our governments are doing, if troops are sent, what they're sent for. And I believe in being an eyewitness. And we'll come on to this because there's so many different methods of finding out what's going on in the world now. But I'm quite an old-fashioned reporter. I mainly do television, but I also write. And I believe it's important to see with your own eyes what's happening. And I also believe that you can't, of course we all want to make the world a better place, and we all want our reporting to change things. And it very rarely does. But I think that the least we can do is that when they say, it wasn't like that, it didn't happen, we can say, oh yes it was, I know because I was there.
Okay, thanks, Lindsey. I mean, Lindsey mentioned just then how some people get into this to make the world a better place and to cast a light on things that otherwise would not be known about. Anand, why did you get into that? Was that your motivation?
That is my motivation. I had a circuitous path into journalism because I used to be a physicist, and I was living across the street from the Twin Towers when the attacks happened. And so I became gripped with following the foreign news in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And eventually I went out to those places, and I found that the story that my government was saying was so radically different from what the reality was on the ground that I thought that I could do something useful by trying to expose the injustices that I was seeing that was being done in my name, in the name of Americans. And so that's why I got into journalism. And it was the war on terror, and then later in 2008, the great financial crisis were the two kind of defining moments of not only mine, but I think our generation's lives. And so most of my reporting is focused on those two issues, but in a foreign context.
Okay. All of you live in places that are, I mean, in this job, it's about getting to know your people, your subjects. I mean, I'll start with you again, Christina. How do you actually get people to open up? You're someone from a faraway land, you turn up to a place. How do you then get that story? It's a skill, isn't it?
Okay, so I think women, Anand, are much better at listening than men. So I think that women make better reporters because I think we're easier to talk to generally. Of course, I mean, that's a massive generalization. But, and I'm lucky because I work for a weekly paper, so I'm not in a big rush to get people to tell me things, so I have the luxury of being able to sit and let people talk at leisure. Because I work for a weekly, we tend to try and do different things to what everyone else is doing. So there is this kind of pack journalism where daily journalists all go, and there's usually an obvious story if you're in the middle of something big to go to. I tend to go the other way because I can't get caught up in that because I need to get something different. And generally I've found sort of taking the other road is a useful thing to do in journalism, and that you end up often with a much better, more interesting story. Sometimes it's not by choice. So after 9/11, I was in Quetta in Pakistan. I was picked up by ISI in the middle of the night and held and kicked out of Pakistan because I was writing about ISI still arming the Taliban. They actually accused me officially of trying to buy an airline ticket in the name of Osama bin Laden, which was on the front pages of all the Pakistan papers without anyone speaking to me. And I don't really think I look like Osama bin Laden. But, anyway, so they expelled me, which meant the only way to get into Afghanistan, which is what everyone was trying to do, was to go through Iran. And the Iranians gave me a visa, which meant I ended up entering Afghanistan through Herat, which very few journalists were in, and actually turned out to be great because it meant I got really quite different stories. So often things that appear to be bad and annoying end up actually working in your favor.
Thanks, Christina. Osna, how do you become an expert suddenly? I mean, sometimes you go to a place, you've never been there before, and you're reporting on it. How do you stay authentic?
Thank you for asking me that question, because it's true that I have often been probably same all of you, but it's sent to places I didn't know about, and probably addition to the Chechen story, I remember when I was doing some, more homely reporting for TV in Norway, and suddenly there was the Kosovo crisis, or the starting war in Kosovo, and all the main correspondents, there's one thing that's holy in Norway, and that is Easter holidays, skiing. Everyone's going to the mountains, and then he pointed at me. It's like, okay, you go. Because I'd been to Chechnya when I was a student, so it's like, you've been a war reporter once in your life, so like that was my second time. And it's like, he asked me, check if you need a visa. And I was like, Kosovo, what country is that now? It was like a handful of the Bosnian War, so it's like, sometimes, and then the next day we were, on our way by car from Greece to Kosovo that did belong to Serbia at the time. And this whole experience ended up in my first book, because I've always combined reporting with books. And let me tell you one episode why it turned from TV to books. There was this guy, a father, whose son had been abducted by Serbian paramilitary forces. And I was doing a story for the evening news, and he was talking in circles, and it took a long time, and I had a translator that was a bit difficult to work with, and all the time I told him, can you just say the part about your son a bit shorter? And at some point I said, because your story is maybe just a minute in my piece, so if you could say it in 30 seconds. I said that, yes. And then he looked at me and he said, what happened to me, I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. And you're telling me to tell this in 30 seconds. Of course, huge mistake, and I never did that again, I hope. But it also was what I thought was the end for me on TV. I was thinking I need to do longer, longer formats, and but then I went back to TV, and for me it's been like going back and forth. But also just very finally, as you were touching upon 9/11, that's also for, I'd never been to that part of the world, but of course with 9/11, what you do, you take the first plane or however you can get to Afghanistan, which I did also, and learning as I went.
Okay, thank you. Lindsey, often foreign correspondents are running towards the danger when everyone's running away. How do you manage that? I mean, people think that foreign correspondents don't get scared in the same way as other people. Is that true?
Not at all. And also, actually, most of the time you're waiting for something to happen or driving in the wrong direction, because you've been told that the important battle, which you need to get to, or the refugee camp or something, is over there. So you go over there, and then you find out actually it's over there. So most of the time is spent driving around trying to find out where something is happening and interviewing the wrong person, and all of that. And so, but also this idea about, some of you may know I wrote a book about Marie Colvin, war correspondent, who was a colleague of Christina's. And it was always said about her, she was fearless, because she got into all sorts of dangerous situations, and in fact lost the sight in her left eye crossing a front line and had to wear an eye patch from then onwards. But I spent a lot of time with Paul Conroy, who was her photographer on her last assignment, which was in Babarama in Syria, where she was killed in 2012. And he said it's absolute rubbish that Marie was fearless. Of course she wasn't fearless. He said you wouldn't want to travel with anyone who was fearless, because that would mean they had no understanding of the situation around them. Of course you're not, of course you're afraid, but you make a decision about whether, you think it's reasonable to go further or not. Now then, the problem you usually have is your own ego. So I work in television, which means that I tend to be working with a team, not by myself. So I'm usually with a producer and a camera operator, and usually a local producer as well. And I had a producer called Sarah, who I loved very much at one point. And we had a very simple system, which was that, because I, of course, want to think that I'm tremendously brave. And so I would say, Sarah, we've got to go further. We've got to go right up to the front line. And she would say, Lindsey, we can't. We've got to go back and file. I say, no, come on, we've got to. She says, Lindsey, you can't. So that was marvelous, because I could pretend to be braver than I really am, safe in the knowledge that Sarah wouldn't let me.
Great. Well, we're talking about bravery. I mean, Anand, you lived with the Taliban for a while. I'm sure everyone asked you this question, so I'm going to ask it as well. Were there moments where you thought, what on earth am I doing? I'm scared, I need to get out of here?
Yeah, I think that like twice a day, actually. That's, yeah, I lived with the Taliban for 2 months. This is about 10 years ago now. And in that time, I was just staying with them in villages in the Afghan countryside. And they would take me out to go meet and greet the population, or occasionally there were attacks. But you know, my sense of what's considered dangerous, I think, I'm always judging it based on the Afghans or Syrians or Iraqis that I'm with. And it's almost always the case that it's more dangerous for them than it is for me, because I have an American passport and I can get out and they're stuck where they are. So from that perspective, I don't actually see myself as doing anything that's all that dangerous. And I'm lucky that I have all these colleagues and friends in these countries who actually take the real risks.
That's a very important point, if you want to come in on that.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the difficulties with this, I don't know about the rest of you, by far the most dangerous things that have ever happened to me were in places that weren't supposed to be dangerous. So that makes it quite hard to judge sometimes.
I think Anand picked up on an important point that all of us probably know, but you probably all don't know, which is actually we couldn't do our jobs without our local fixers, our translators, our drivers. Does one of you want to kind of explain the importance of that? Because it's not just that a team from somewhere else comes in, it's that we rely on local sources, don't we?
Oh, you know, absolutely. In television, so I work in all sorts of different places in the world, and I don't speak all these languages. Now, I work a lot in the Arab world, and I don't speak Arabic, and I don't speak Kurdish, and I work quite a lot in places, parts of the world where they do. And so I'm very reliant on a local translator, fixer, and driver. And those are people who understand what's going on much better than I do. And, you know, one recent example, I mean, Anand was in the same place at the same time. We were in northeast in northeast Syria in October, November, which is an area which is controlled by Syrian Kurds, and they had very successfully fought against the Islamic State with American and to some extent British and French backing. And the Kurds had lost 11,000 of their own people in defeating Islamic State in that area. And suddenly President Trump decided that he was withdrawing American support. And what that meant was that the Turks, who are the big enemy of the Kurds, could invade across the border from Turkey, which they did, and start trying to ethnically cleanse that border area. Now, we were entirely reliant on our local fixer and driver for understanding, you know, what was where and which village was where and so on, and what was safe and what was not safe. But also, we felt this tremendous guilt, because, I mean, I'm not American, but I felt, I mean, I had never been in a betrayal that felt worse than this. That these people had fought and lost so much for a battle which was on behalf of all of us, you know, to put down the Islamic State, which I do believe is a threat to the whole world. Certainly it's a threat to Britain. And then what happened was that the Kurds, not unreasonably, decided that their best protection was Russia and Syria. And so the Syrian government would come back in. Now, I'm not beloved of the Syrian government because of the stories that I've written and so on, and because we were all there without an official Syrian government visa. So we decided that we had to leave. I mean, and as we left, I mean, the situation looked so bad as we left, and I will never forget the driver and the fixer just crying as we left. And I was crying too. We were all crying. Now, the situation has stabilized, and in fact, they are safe and it's all right. But that's a moment that doesn't leave me.
Christina, do we need to be the ones telling these stories? Why can't local journalists tell the stories? Why do we have our jobs?
Of course they can, and you know they have the advantage of local knowledge, and now with social media, I mean, people always see a lot more citizen journalism. The only problem with some of that, when they're not actually journalists and you don't know who they are and whether what they're saying is actually propaganda or... but I do think that I would say this because this is my job, but that there is still a place for foreign correspondents to go into places and see things because they're not compromised by either side and to see things through their own eyes. And I think it's really important that we do that. And actually, I mean, the place that I've been most involved with, Afghanistan, I've gone back and forth since 88, so it's really a long time. And every so often I read, so I think I know it really well, but then every so often I read a story from a journalist who is in Afghanistan for the first time. And I read it and think, oh, actually, that's really interesting. And I take too many things for granted in Afghanistan that are not normal because I go there too much.
Anand, you wanted to say something, did you, on that?
I can't remember what the question was.
You just kind of gestured. Okay, fine. I mean, it's about having a fresh pair of eyes.
Oh, right. Yes. I was going to say that I see my job as translating the experiences of people in these countries for American audiences. So Syrian journalists or Iraqi journalists are perfectly capable of telling their story. I may be more capable of telling it to Americans in a particular way. So that's why I try to spend years at a time in a community trying to understand it from the inside, to try to make the choices of people in war zones legible to those who are outside. So that was the reason why I lived with the Taliban, is not because I wanted to whitewash the crimes of the Taliban, but instead to make people understand why it would be that ordinary people might decide to join such a movement like this.
Can I come in there? Because there is a whole sort of new thing now as well, sort of new at least in the last few years. It really sort of started really in 2009 in Iran with the uprising after the elections there, which is what we call UGC, user-generated content in television, which is people taking their own videos and so on. And in Syria, there's been a lot of that because there's been a lot of places which have been really just too dangerous to go to or too difficult to get into, and people there are using video to tell their own stories. And there's come up with a sort of like a new kind of journalism. We employ somebody at Channel 4 News where I work called Kamal Kaddoura, who's a Lebanese journalist, and he lived through the civil war in Lebanon himself, who now spends his time in video. So when a video comes up, I don't know if this really happened today or last week, and it really is the place it says it is or somewhere else, but it's Kamal's job to find that out, and he can work that out. Obviously, he's an Arabic speaker, and he's become an expert on this particular kind of journalism. And to me, it's really interesting because he's not an eyewitness in the way that I feel I need to be an eyewitness. And yet in lots of ways, Kamal knows more about the war in Syria than almost any other journalist, than any journalist I know, because he spends his whole life immersed in this video. So there are new techniques which I think can add to what we have as foreign correspondents going in.
Lindsey, you touched on the changing nature of the job and how with all these different sources coming in, social media, people becoming citizen journalists, we're able to see things a lot quicker. And I would just be interested to ask the panel just how their jobs have changed. I mean, I remember reading something about the BBC correspondent in New York when John Lennon was shot, called Tom Brooke. And he wrote about how he had to get a taxi, and then he had to go to a phone, and then he had to try and call the copy through. He couldn't just write a tweet saying John Lennon's dead. So I don't know which one of you wants to take that first, just about how Osna, do you want to say about how your role has changed in that sense? The speed at which stories are disseminated means we're sort of competing against other sources too.
Yes, I'm not working any longer in news, so probably...
You're also not very old.
Yeah, that's
true. So you
true.
probably never used a telex machine.
Well, I do remember that what is closest to this would be, again, back to Chechnya, because that was middle of the 90s. And there was, we got a breaking news, me and a couple of French journalists, about negotiations at the time between the President Yeltsin and the President Maskadov of the Chechens. But we couldn't, how could we file the news? Then we looked up like the one we found like on the roadside, that we met an AFP journalist who had a satellite phone, which is, you can't carry it. You can't, it just fits in the back of a trunk. So we asked her if we could borrow it. And she's like, yeah, you can borrow it, but then I'm filing the story. So she filed the news, but according to the journalist of. So it's like, and then usually if it was other stories, we had to go to the local telegraph, and there were 2 of them in Chechnya, in Grozny and one in Shali. And it's not like you could file the story to your home country, because you had to file it within Russia. So you had to file it to someone in Moscow for them to send it on to London or wherever. So I had this friend at the Norwegian embassy, because I had to find someone who spoke Norwegian to call in the story. But also these things that about are we on the right road? Are we going left? Are we going right? There's only things you can check is on the ground. There's no one you can you look up on internet, or so that is really, of course,
I just want Lindsey
changed.
to tell her great story
but also,
as well.
I want to say on that, I think so in the old days when we had to file by telex from the post office, and they would be reading. I remember being a coup in Burundi, who cares? I cared, I was there. They don't want me to get the news out. I so wish I had been able to write in Norwegian, because then they wouldn't have known what I was writing. I tried English, I tried Spanish. I mean, obviously they speak French, so, but to try and get the damn news out without them stopping me, Norwegian would have been perfect. Because that was what Freddie Forsyth, that was how he filed from Biafra, wasn't it, in Welsh? And he kept saying, oh, it's a garble, and on it went. No, but the story I was telling Rajini earlier was I used to be the stringer for the BBC in Nairobi, in Kenya, back in the 80s. And when we had a radio story, we would be on a cassette, and we would drive out to the airport, myself or Mike Wooldridge, who was the correspondent who later came here, and we would go up to the British Airways queue, can you imagine this now, and say, I work for the BBC, anybody British, will you take a cassette to London tonight? And somebody would always step up and say, yes, I'll take it. And then there was a department of the BBC, which was based at the airport, who would have and then we'd get the name, and we'd ring it with the name, and they would stand there with a notice, and they would give the cassette over and sometimes give them a cab home. I mean, that was the system.
The story you're telling about filing in Norwegian reminds me of Zimbabwe, because we were banned as journalists, and so you had to be very careful on the phone speaking from there, and they have all the latest Chinese technology from their friends. And so we developed a kind of code in talking to our editors. We used to refer to Mugabe as Ibagum, because, we used to refer to Mugabe as the Yorkshireman, because Mugabe backwards is Ibagum. But talking about the changes in the job, I mean, so I've been doing it 32 years, which may be longer than anyone else, I think, as a foreign correspondent.
How long have you been doing this, Lindsey?
A long time.
So back in '88, going in and out of Afghanistan, there were no phones at all in Afghanistan. So you had to actually go back to Pakistan to file. There was no direct dialing from Pakistan, so you then had to call the international operator. And so by the time you actually filed a story, I mean, it was weeks after you'd been. So, but actually, I mean, the good thing did mean that you really knew what you were talking about, usually. Now, sometimes when you can file from the top of a mountain in, the Hindu Kush immediately, you're much more likely to be a victim of propaganda. But I remember the night that General Zia was killed, and I was one of the only foreign correspondents in Pakistan, and he was killed in the evening. And in fact, I was supposed to be going to Afghanistan that night, with a group of mujahideen, and then I had asked a Pakistani friend to go and get some vodka because I was a bit nervous about the trip and I wanted to drink before I went. And then he came back and within 10 minutes with no vodka, and he said, "You won't believe what I've heard, but General Zia has just been killed in a plane crash." And I said, "Look, if you don't want to go and buy vodka, you could come up with a more convincing excuse than that." But he said, "No, it's true." So then went and talked to people. And so and I was only 22, I had this huge story, and it was the old days of rotary phones, and I was trying to dial the international operator in Pakistan, I think it was 123, over and over again, and I just could not get through. And I was literally in tears, because this was like my great big story, and I couldn't get through. It took me more than an hour. Finally, by the time I got through to the foreign news editor at the Financial Times, I was in quite a state. And fortunately, it was answered by a man called Stuart Dorby, who had covered Vietnam and was a sort of grizzled old hack. And he said to me, "Sit down, have a cigarette, and this is what we want." And we kept the phone line open because we couldn't risk not getting a line again. It cost an absolute fortune, because that's the other thing. I mean, phone costs used to be a lot more than they are now. So I would say at the beginning, 90% of my job was logistics, finding a way to get the story back. Now you don't even think about it.
So
I think it took me a week to get the news of the Burundi coup out.
And people were waiting with
Oh
bated
my
breath.
God, they were absolutely wrapped. What the hell is going on in Burundi? They were asking themselves.
the masses got your story in the end. You talk about logistics. This is more of a point rather than, because I want to start moving on to questions shortly. Is some of the silly logistics in this job is just, when am I going to eat, isn't it? When am I going to go to the toilet, which we were discussing before. Anyway, moving on to a more serious point is we often see a lot of horror close up. We see death, we see destruction in this job. My colleague Fergal Keane, BBC Africa editor, stepping down from his role this week because of PTSD. We all have colleagues who have PTSD, and it's something not talked about enough in this job. Anand, how do you deal with seeing traumatic scenes? And, when you go back to New York, when you've left Syria or wherever, is that when you start to process it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't even notice. People close to me point out that I talk about the deaths of people I know very nonchalantly now. I don't really dwell on it. And obviously for people back home, it's a big deal. And I didn't even realize that was the case. And I went back and looked at, so I don't even know what a telex is, actually. So I became a journalist much after all that. So I was using digital address book. So went back and looked at
Snapchat, yeah?
Yeah, basically, yeah. And, just it was like a month ago, I went back and looked at it, and I was astonished at the sheer number of people in there who have passed away, who have been killed prematurely. But with that being said, I think the communities that I report on, especially most recently in Syria, are suffering pretty extraordinary psychological trauma on the one hand, but also still have pretty resilient social structures to be able to deal with it and absorb it in a way that maybe back in the US, which is much more isolated and atomized, they don't have. So I don't know if that confers some kind of protective quality to people's trauma, but that's what I've noticed. And I've found that in all of these places, they're actually able to deal with these things sometimes better than foreigners.
Lindsey, how do you deal with seeing something really horrific when you're away from it afterwards?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I was looking up some of the statistics on this, and generally amongst war correspondents or correspondents who cover conflict, between a quarter and a third are likely to have some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, manifests itself with not being able to work, not being able to form relationships, bad dreams, drinking too much, lots of these sort of symptoms. And I think that many of us may show some of those symptoms some of the time, but it doesn't mean it overwhelms our lives. And I think it is important to try as much as you can to have some kind of balance and stability in your life. And I have an alter ego, and my alter ego is a North London housewife, and you should see my garden. Now, it's small, it's probably about the size of this stage, but it is good. right? It's the structure. It's quite formal in structure. Do you want me to tell you about the bulbs I planted? Okay, the bulbs. So this year I've gone for orange and black and purple in my tulips. Not sure that was a good choice, but you know, I do actually get very kind of invested in this stuff, and so I think that is, I think, for me that's what works, is to have another part of life, and I realize that what I find difficult is the disorder all around me, the chaos of all this stuff, and so I want, my house is quite tidy, you know, I want to sort of stamp order on it somehow, and also I'm lucky in my relationships, friendships, those kind of things. For other people, it's family. And also, sometimes it's fine to cry. Sometimes it's fine to be sad. And sometimes you will have a nightmare. You've witnessed terrible things. You have to let yourself do all that.
Osna, have you ever cried after you've covered something?
Yes, I have many times. And I think that as reporters, maybe we have an advantage over photographers. That's my impression, the fact that I remember this scene in Baghdad, you know, there's a rocket that fell on a market, and all this, you know, you see children without heads. It's like, it's undescribable. It's just, and even more than seeing the children is to see when the parents find them. So I think maybe the worst impression of, you know, such a scene was at a morgue in Baghdad after one of those rockets fell on a neighborhood. I was at a morgue, and where you could, you know, the mother obviously on shopping, you know, not describe how they looked like, but then there was a boy, maybe 12, lying on one of those bunk beds in the morgue. And I'm there, and I hear this scream, and this is when when you hear or read about a scream that is, you know, like an animal. It's like I never heard a scream like that, and that was a father, or he looked like the father, and obviously the brother of that boy, finding him without the back of his head. And it's those scenes that they don't leave me. That scene has never left me, and it's like left me. But again, I had to go back to my hotel and write about, you know, this was today in Baghdad during the war. This is what happened, and I could describe the scene without having, as a photographer, having to stay on, focus, maybe, you know, it's like, so I do think that that's also part of the therapy, the fact that you get the story out, I get it out in the writing, and then able to talk about it, and I think it's also about balance, just as Lindsey says, when it comes to PTSD, it matters a lot also, who are you when you go into the war?
I think sometimes we're expected to be superhuman, aren't we, and be able to kind of divorce the feelings that we have. I mean, I know I'm the moderator, but I just remember after my dad died having to go and speak to people who were grieving relatives in Orlando and just not wanting to, because they'd come out of the hospital and found out that their relatives had died and were screaming, the way I remembered, that my dad wasn't going to make it through the end of the day. And it was that moment where I actually said to my cameraman, I said, I don't want to talk to them today. I mean, I think this is an invasion, but sometimes people do want to tell their stories, and it's really tricky, isn't it, Christina, knowing when the right moment is to kind of just make sure that you've got the right empathy, but also you're doing your job.
I think, the hardest thing, I guess, is when children are victims. I remember the terrorist attack in Nice, when all the people had been on the seafront, and then the truck came and killed 87 people. A lot of those victims were children. That was really difficult. But I think, for me, the two hardest things about it, one is coming back. I mean, it's not so hard. What we do is not normal. We go to places where normal people are leaving. But actually, when you're there, you're kind of caught up in the story, even if it's something really terrible, and you feel like you're doing something important, telling other people about it. But it's when you come back, I find it really hard. Like, my mum, who lives in sort of suburban South London and has hardly ever travelled anywhere, when I come back and she's going on to me about what the neighbours are doing with their tree, or how her train was late, and I've just come back from places where if people go out in the morning, they may well not come back. And it's really difficult sometimes to be sympathetic. And I have to realize, that it's wrong, because obviously it is important to her. But for me, the most traumatic things actually are not the horror of war things. It's actually where you go to a country over and over again and report on things and it doesn't make a difference. And actually, Zimbabwe again, people are always surprised when I say I find that the most traumatic place for me, because it's not where I've seen, although I have seen terrible things, but somehow when you're covering a war, people are fighting a war for a reason. You might not agree with the reason, but there's some reason to do it. And whereas in Zimbabwe, all the terrible things Mugabe did to his own people, torturing them, killing them, starving them, was entirely so that he could stay in power, and it was to his own people. And for years, I have gone back and forth writing about it, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. And I remember once, and I pour my heart into these stories, and once I had a really difficult year where in the same year I'd been ambushed by the Taliban and almost killed. I was on Benazir Bhutto's bus when it was blown up in that huge bomb which killed 150 people. I was in a hotel that was suicide bombed, all within a really short amount of time. And I started to feel, because I think we do get a bit superstitious and think that luck matters too. And I started to feel my luck was running out. And then when I came back to London from being on Benazir's bus, that very night I came back, I went to a dinner for a very brave human rights lawyer from Zimbabwe called Beatrice Matetwa. And at that dinner, I said to her, I'm thinking about giving up. I mean, I had literally, the night before, after the bus bombing, I had woken up in the morning with bits of flesh on my pillow, because so many people around me had been killed. And so I said to her, I was thinking of giving up because too many bad things are happening, and also because it doesn't make a difference. These wars never end. What's happening in Zimbabwe never ends. And she said to me, look, if people like you don't report on what people like me are doing, what's the point of what we're doing? And that really made me think. And actually, I have a child, and at that time, he really liked a Dr. Seuss book called Lorax, and the Lorax. And there's a line in that about how people should really, really care, like the Lorax. And so that just made me think, no, actually, it's still important to tell these people's stories. They're the people that are risking their lives.
Round of applause for that. We're very glad that you didn't give up journalism, Christina, because if I might say, you're a badass. In fact, all of our panel are. I mean, if you just look at the countries that they've been to, the stories that they've told, the books that they've written, it is quite remarkable, and that is why what they do is so, so important. I want to open it up. Yep. Give them another round of applause. They're brilliant. I would like to open it up to questions a little bit earlier, because I'm sure lots of you have questions, and I've got one here to read out in a second as well from a contest winner. But let's go to the audience straight away. The lady in the second row there.
Hi, my question is regarding, in this age of fake news, as foreign correspondent, for example, BBC is assumed to be representing something. How do you make sure the stories that you see is actually how it ends up on TV? And you have editors as well who have to edit the stories. So how does that work in your job now to make sure that what we see is actually authentic? Because I think most of us now, we kind of doubt what we see on media is being unauthentic.
Okay, thank you. Now, that actually is the same question I was going to read out, so that kills two birds with one stone. So the Rajasthan Patrika contest winner was a question which was from Ekta Jain, who asked similarly, in a world filled with fake news, how do you ensure the legitimacy of your sources? Osna?
I'll be brief on that because I do mainly books now, so this is probably more for Lindsey and the two others. But the reason I went from TV to books is actually to be able to have time to found my own impressions, to stay in a place, do journalism first, and then to stay a year or two afterwards. But I'm looking forward to listen to the others about, like, you have to make decisions quickly. Is this fake or not?
Anand?
Yeah, the process for me, and I think in American journalism is a little different. People may not know. So I write for magazines like the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine, which have a pretty extensive fact-check process. So what happens is I will file an article from a place like Syria, and then the magazine will assign one or two fact-checkers to the article, and they'll go through the article, line by line, and call the sources that I interviewed again, go and check all of the sort of claims that I made in the article. It's a luxury that's there just for magazine writing because it usually takes a long time for a piece to come out. But despite that, so I report a lot on Syria, and the Syrian war is very contentious because I've been to villages where the Russians and the Syrian regime have massacred people. Like I went to one village where Syrian-backed militias came in and killed every man, woman, and child in the village. They set people's bodies on fire, and I was there. I photographed all of this, and despite that, there was a pushback online saying this is fake news. There are very powerful interests, I think, that also promote this, and in this case, the Russian government. And then there's a deeper issue in which I think understandably a lot of people are distrusting of elites because the elites have done such a terrible job of running this world. And so they see the media as part of that. And so I can understand where the sentiment comes from. But for American journalism, at least for magazines, there is a pretty rigorous fact-check process.
Just before we go to another question, I do want to ask Lindsey, because I think unlike the other panelists, it might be 5 o'clock in the evening, you get a video, it shows some massacre or something, you've got to go to air to Channel 4 News in a few hours. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think that there's a difference between fake news and getting something wrong. Right, so fake news is something which, the aim is to distort or to tell the opposite story. And I too have come across very much what Anand is talking about, particularly on Syria, where, we have reliable sources we know who have taken pictures even if we weren't there. You're talking about something where you were there, but even if we weren't there, sources who we know who have taken pictures of attacks, particularly by the Russian Air Force and the Syrians, and we know the aircraft, we know the kind of bombs, we know there's a lot of forensic stuff you can do on video, and yet, or particularly with chemical weapons. I mean, I have watched, I can't tell you how many frames of children dying of ingesting chemical weapons and chlorine gas that I have been through forensically with experts on, do they foam at the mouth with this kind of chemical weapon or this kind of chemical weapon? That much detail that we go into, and yet people will come and say, oh, it was staged, the children were actors. And the aim of that is to cast doubt on the work that we do, but we do verify as much as we can, and we are careful. And we do, as much as we can. That doesn't mean that we never make a mistake. And I'm sure I have made mistakes.
Let's get a couple more questions. Just on that point, when you say people, I mean, sometimes those people are governments as well.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about the Russian Syrian government and their followers.
Let's get a question from the back. Well, let's get two questions at once. So the gentleman in the orange shirt there, and then the lady here has had her hand up as well.
Yeah, this is a question for Christina. You talked about Ziaul Huq's death. So what do you think really happened? Who killed Ziaul Huq? And the second question, which you would have been asked umpteen times, do you really believe that ISI did not know about Osama bin Laden living in Abbottabad?
Okay, you're going to get me in trouble.
I'm just going to get another question, and I think if we can keep them more specific, general, pardon me, so that all the panel can ask, rather than going into specific foreign policy questions, if you don't mind, then everyone can sort of chime in. This is more about the role of what we do, rather than, obviously, picking our expert panel's deep knowledge on the subject. So the lady there, quick question there. You don't have a microphone. Okay, who's coming?
Thank you. It's my question to the women on the panel.
Woo.
Now, as war correspondents and as, reporters, what kind of pressure do you face from your family? Like here in India, if we have, relatives and everybody talking about, where is she going, where is she going, what about her family? Because women are supposed to be there for the family more than the men. So what has been your experience about, maybe family, children?
Let's pick up on that point, because it's no secret that there are 4 of us on the panel who are women, and there's a man of colour. And normally the cliche and the convention for decades has been that a foreign correspondent has generally been a well-educated white man. So it's great that we have a very diverse panel, but we didn't want to make a thing of it, because we're not defined by that. We're defined by the work that we all do. But it's a very important question. Do you want to go first on that, Christina?
Yeah. So, I mean, I started off, like I said, just, going off to this wedding in Pakistan, and then I decided I was going to go and live there. So my mum didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't know I was going to start covering war. It was only then foreign editors were really not that interested in Pakistan and were interested in Afghanistan, where the Russians were at the time. So I then spent all my time going in and out with the Mujahideen. To be honest, we've talked about the lack of communications in those days really worked in my favour, because my mum had no idea what I was doing. The way I communicated with her was by sending a letter. So if I was going off to Afghanistan for a long period, because sometimes I went for like a month or something, I would leave postcards for her, which I'd ask people to send at various intervals. Although the post was so bad from Pakistan, I was usually back by the time. So she really didn't have much idea what I was doing. I have to say, when I became a mum myself, and my son went off on a gap year and was going on motorbikes in Vietnam and such things, I realised what she must have gone through. And so, I don't know, I mean, my close family, my husband and son, as long as my husband's known me, it's what I've done. So I'd already been a war correspondent for 12 years or something before we got married, so it wasn't going to stop me doing it. In fact, I probably wouldn't have been able to do what I do without him, because he did the lion's share of childcare early on, because my son was born in 99 and then 9/11 happened 2 years later, and then I was really away a lot. And he would do most of the childcare, so I've been very lucky. But I do slightly I often wonder, why don't people ask men what's it like being a father and a war correspondent? Because people always asking me about being a mother and a war correspondent.
Lindsey, we talked broadly, actually, before we came on stage about how important it is, actually, to have people from different backgrounds telling stories. Also, just because they can see people like them on screen. Just to answer our question.
Yeah. I mean, on the family issue, I can honestly say I've never faced any pressure from my family at all. None. So it's just not an issue for me. But as far as I'm concerned, in the women thing, look, we need all sorts of different people reporting. And one of the things which I think is really good, I work a lot in the Arab world, is the number of young Arab women who are coming up as reporters and as camera operators and journalists in general. And that, to me, is tremendous. And there is a lot of pressure from family there. And, I work with a little scheme which we started in Marie Colvin's name, called the Marie Colvin Journalist Network, where we try and provide support to young female Arab journalists. And sometimes it's having a mentor, an older female journalist, to say, actually, it's okay, you can do it, sit down and talk to your family, explain exactly what you're doing. And, sometimes, and, I work with a young woman in London who's of Bangladeshi origin and so on. And when she first came to me and said she wanted to be a journalist, the problem was that her father wouldn't let her. But she got on a trainee scheme, sort of bit by bit she pushed. And now he's all over London, my daughter the journalist. He's so proud of her. So, you know, families change.
Yeah, and I think just, again, not to over-flatter my wonderful esteemed panellists, but, you know, certainly coming from a South Asian community in the UK, knowing that the Christinas, the Osners, the Lindseys, the Lise Doucets, the Orla Gurins were already doing it, meant that I could say to my parents, look, I can do it too. And, you know, here we are. Should we get some other questions? Because we've only got about 3.5 minutes. Lady there with the bright coloured scarf and the lady next, these two here, we'll take those together.
A very good afternoon to the esteemed panel. So my question is, how do you deal with plagiarism in journalism? And since you said that, you know, you tend to get emotionally attached to the stories that you do because, you know, it's so devastating. So how do you manage to be unbiased in your reporting? How do you keep your emotions aside and write a story and tell the truth to the world?
Okay, and your question there?
Good afternoon, everyone. My question to Anand sir. Anand sir, what is patriotism for you in this present scenario? And second question is that how a writer contribute to reducing terrorism in present scenario? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks for those questions. We'll just have time to pick up on one of those, which actually is another contest winner. So I'll read that out as well, which is Sunny Sam, who asked, how do we keep bias out of stories, which is effectively what the lady there was also saying. We've only got a couple of minutes, so this is probably going to be our last question. So how do we how do we detach our emotions from what we report?
I don't think there's anything wrong with showing emotions in stories. If you see something terrible, then, you know, people should know that. So it's not so much a question of bias. Of course, there's always this long discussion about objectivity and can you really be objective? You always see things through your own background, and so I think you're never going to be completely objective, sadly. But we try and show things from both sides. But if something bad's happening, people should know that something's bad's happening. I don't think it's our job to sort of hide our emotions from that.
Okay, Anand?
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm not neutral when I report. I mean, if there's a dictator bombing a civilian population, I'm on the side of the civilians who are being bombed. I think you can write about that and still write about it accurately and objectively and still not be neutral. And we tend to conflate those two concepts, neutrality and objectivity.
Osner?
Yeah, I think I've developed over time, and I've had to question myself what you're asking about being biased throughout. I'm from Norway, as been said, and I think being a Norwegian, you grow up thinking you're always on the side of good. You're for a just world. You know, we have gender equality, we have kind of class equality, and I think I felt that my position in the world was neutral. And then, of course, realizing, okay, you're born into this feminist, leftist society. You're born in a certain time in the 70s. You know, like, my worldviews, of course, are formed by who I am. And maybe the most telling example in my career was the book, The Bookseller of Kabul, because it got so much criticism. I still think, and I still thought that I was writing it neutrally. You know, judging the patriarch, the bookseller, you know, from a neutral point of view. But of course, even though I'm not present in my story, there is my very, you know, feminist views just coming across, seeping into the story. I just think that I've come, a bit like Anand, I've come to realize that I do have a stand and that neutrality does not exist. But then it's better to, like, we have names and we have biographies, and we can't say that, you know, well, we try, of course, to have all news and see a story from all sides. But I think we have to also, it boils down to the fact that we also have our views and a certain, you know, our ethics and our morals.
So we've run out of time, but it doesn't matter. I want Lindsey to have the last word on this. So just in answer to that question.
This is one of the reasons why it's so important that we have a diverse body of foreign correspondents, because we do all come from somewhere. And I don't like the word bias, but I agree with my colleagues that we're all coming with our own backgrounds and our own beliefs. And therefore it's important that we should be of different races, nationalities, genders, everything. Having said that, I do think there is such a thing as journalistic ethics, and I think there is such a thing as being fair and listening to people who you disagree with. I think it's really important. We'll take Syria, that's where some of us have spent a lot of time. It doesn't mean, there is an objective truth, which is that the Russians are bombing civilians. Anand has seen it, so have I. It doesn't mean you don't listen to the Russian point of view and try and understand why they're doing it. It's very important to understand why they're doing it. It's always very important to understand perpetrators and terrorists and understand their motivations. That's part of what we do. But when it comes down to it, what we are trying to do is tell the story of what's really happening, tell the stories of the victims and the victors, and to try and be fair and to try in as much as we can to tell the truth. That is what we're trying to do.
Well, I think on that note, that ends our session. Thank you very much to Lindsey, Anand, Osna, and Christina, pointing in the wrong way. And thank you to all of you for listening.
Once again, thanks to Christina Lam, Anand Gopal, Lindsey Hilsum, Rajini Vaidyanathan, and to moderator for the session, Rajini Vaidyanathan. This session was presented to you by Rajasthan Patrika, the Leadership Series. The authors will sign books, so you can pick up copies of their books at the JCB Prize for Literature bookshop, managed by Full Circle. You'll find that next to Charbagh on the left-hand side. The authors will make their way now to the Z kiosk, which is at the far right corner of the Nexa front lawn. So do go and pick up a copy of their books, and they will meet you back here in the far right corner for an author signing. And we'll do a quick turnaround on stage and go straight into our next event here at the Nexa front lawn, which is the book launch of The Secrets of Amir, which will take place in just a few minutes.